In this video, I'm going to break down an old school texturing technique of creating masks in Photoshop using the clouds filter. Something that's been done back in the day, but seems to have been lost as a method. And it's a good technique to know when you want to generate quick procedural masks to use in your game engine, such as blending between two textures. And I'll show you how to do this in UE5. So essentially what a mask is, it's a black and white texture that will control the visibility of what will show up and what will be hidden. Or you can blend between two different textures using the mask to determine where each texture will show up. And there are many other uses for using masks. So let's go ahead and create a basic mask first, and then I'll show you some variations you can introduce. In Photoshop, I'm going to go to File and create a brand new canvas that will be used as a texture. I'm going to go to File, New, and I'm going to use 2K texture, 2048 by 2048. Simply enter width, height at 2K, 2048 by 2048. You can lower this to 1024 by 1024 or even lower, making sure to keep these values in the power of 2. Resolution is going to stay at 72. Color mode is going to be set to RGB and 8-bit. And I'm just going to hit create. Now to generate your basic mask using the clouds filter, the first thing you need to do is set your foreground and your background to black and white. You can simply click on this icon right here to set it. Or you can choose manually by clicking on the foreground, setting it to black, and doing the same thing to the background, setting it to white. It can be vice versa. It doesn't have to be black first, white second. You can switch these around. It doesn't really matter as long as they're black and white. And if you press D, this will set these two automatically to black and white. So if I had something else chosen, let's say this red, by hitting D, that's the shortcut key to set the foreground and background to black and white. Now go to Filter, Render, Clouds. And that's your first very basic procedural generic mask that you could use. So let's go ahead and save this. That's going to be our first one. And I'm going to show you how you can push these values to have more clear definition of black and white. So some of the textures will show up more clearly. So in order to save your masks, you need to export them as PNG. You can do other file formats like Targa, but PNG, keep the file low while still maintaining good quality. To export a mask or a texture out of Photoshop, you simply go to File, Export, and choose Export As. You can quick export as PNG, but we're going to go through a longer menu with a lot more options. So I'm going to choose Export, Export As. I'm going to choose the format, PNG. We don't need transparency, so I'm going to disable it. We don't have any transparency. Image size is going to remain at 2K, our texture size, and not going to be changing anything else here. Just essentially making sure that it's set to PNG, and then let's hit export. Choose a location where you want to save your texture masks into, and I'm ready to have a folder, so I know where to find them. Give a file name. Let's name ours mask_01. Save as type, PNG, and click save. And that's it. You are done creating and saving your first texture mask. Some slight variations you can introduce is after applying the clouds filter for the very first time, if you reapply the same clouds filter, just run it again, you'll have a different result. So if you go to filter, and you can see up here, this retains your last year's filter, and there's a shortcut key for it, so you can just simply use this, or you could just go to Filter, Render, and run clouds again. Let's hit Ctrl-Alt-F to run it again. And you can see when I ran it the second time, it gave me a little bit more defined areas. So let me go ahead and just remove this. I'm going to set it back to white. Let's run it for the very first time. Render, clouds. So here's the result. If I'm going to run that filter again by repeating it, instead of going through the filter render menu by hitting Ctrl-Alt-F, it gives you a better representation of black and white and just kind of clears up those areas of grayscale in between. So running it a second time by pressing Ctrl-Alt-F just gives you a little bit more definition in your blacks and your whites. Another variation you can introduce is that let me go ahead and reset this back to the generic filter, render, clouds, a little bit more softer approach. And we could use different clouds to apply on top of this. And this will give you even more separation and definition between black and the whites. So remember, the black and the whites are going to define which part of the texture will show up. And the more definition you have, the more separation you have between the black and the whites. The more of clarity and more of those textures you will see when using this mask. So this right here, there are too many grayscales in between, and you're going to have a more softer blend with this mask. But when you have more clear separation of black and white, that's where you really get to see the mask take effect. And you'll see this when we get into UE5. But instead of just using this or maybe running the filter again, which will give you a slightly better result. Once you generate your very first clouds, let me just reset it again to white. So we just take that step again, go to filter, render, and choose clouds. And now once you've applied the clouds filter one time, go to filter, render, and choose difference clouds. You have to run the clouds filter one time before you can use the different clouds. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So after applying different clouds, you can see that there's a lot more separation of black and white. So it essentially kind of inverts the values and gives you more contrast. And now you can repeat this different clouds for a different look, a different effect. And let's run this one more time, Control Alt F. So you can just essentially just keep pressing Control Alt F after running different clouds and find the mask that you would want to use. So let's go ahead and just choose one. This one right here is good enough. Let's go ahead and export this. Control Alt Shift W. That's the shortcut key to export as. Control Alt Shift W. Or you can go to File, Export, and then export the other way. So the settings are going to stay the same. Just going to simply hit export it as a PNG. That's going to be our second mask. And let's generate one more. And in this one, I'm going to give you slightly different tools to make adjustments to make that black and white separation a lot more clear. So you have a lot more definition in your mask between the black and white values. So I'm going to reset this back to white by filling the layer, the background layer with white. In this case, it's Control Backspace. That's the shortcut key to fill your canvas, the selected layer, with the background color, which happens to be white right now. Control Backspace. Alt Backspace will fill it with a foreground color, which happens to be black. So let me hit Control Backspace. Shortcut keys are extremely important. They're going to speed up your workflow a lot. So let's go ahead and render basic clouds. Go to filter. Again, my foreground and background I set to black and white. That's correct. Filter and render and clouds. Just as a side note, if you have any other color chosen, for example, let's say red or another as foreground, something as background, these are the colors that are going to be used to generate your clouds. And that's not what you want. You want a black and white value. The masks have to be in linear space. They have to be black and white. So if I use these colors, and let's say I then check on them, render clouds, that's what we will get. So that's not what you want. Make sure to press D to set the foreground and the background to black and white. I'm going to fill it back with white. And now let's generate clouds. Filter, render, clouds. All right, so we have this effect, this result right here. We can push these values a lot more by using two different settings. We can use levels, or we can use curves, or we can use both. It's essentially going to create more contrast and more separation between black and white. The best way to use levels and curves is to use them as adjustment layers. So essentially it's going to be an extra layer applied on top of your image, and you're going to be able to edit levels or curves non-destructively while maintaining this mask, this texture right here without destroying it. So to do this, I have my background. That's the only layer I have. I'm going to click on this icon right here and add an adjustment layer. And in this case, let's do an adjustment layer for levels. You can see that it added an adjustment layer on top. So we're going to retain the information in our background and not destroy it. And we're going to make adjustments to the levels. By selecting this layer, you have this histogram right here. You have your shadows, you have your midtones, and you have your highlights. And you can just push these sliders and kind of clamp and reduce the information of the black and white, and then introduce more contrast to your texture, to your mask. So if I wanted to have more white and black separation, I would just start pushing these values and create more of that separation, more visibility of the mask. So this would be, for example, a good mask to use because I now have some more strong separation of whites and blacks. And of course I can push it even further to only have black and whites, and kind of like almost remove the grayscale values. So something like that. So that would be a good mask to use to blend between two textures, or to hide one part of the texture from another, for example. Or maybe even use it as some kind of dirt, procedural dirt on top of another texture by introducing color on top. Another way is to use curves. So instead of levels, we have curves. So let me go ahead and hide this. So we still have this information inside the adjustment layers for levels. We can always bring it back. And we didn't mess up our original layer. So I'm going to create a brand new adjustment layer, and this one is going to be curves. Curves is a little harder to use if you never used it before, but essentially it's very similar to levels with a lot more control. And you simply have the same histogram where you can adjust and clamp the black and white values with a little bit more control in between those values. But you can also add additional points and kind of push along the entire histogram of what information you'd want to push furthermore to whites or to blacks or to midtones. And you can add additional points. And if you don't want to have too many points or you added too many, you can always kind of remove them by selecting them and hitting delete. to kind of get back to where you were. So by playing around with this, you can get some pretty good results and clamp that information of black and white to a more usable mask that will look good when you start using it inside UE5. Let me go ahead and push this. So something like this. So let's say this is our mask, and that's what we want to use. And now let's go ahead and export. Let's go to File. Instead of using the shortcut this time, Export, Export As, and that's our third mask. PNG, everything stays the same, hit Export. And this is going to be our 3. Mask 03. So that's just a few ways you can adjust the default clouds filter to create different versions of your mask. And as a side note, all these textures, all these masks are tiling. So there's not going to be any seams in between them, and you'll be able to repeat them over large surfaces. So these masks are actually pretty good for anything that's going to tile on a larger surface, such as a landscape, or a larger piece of geometry where these masks have to tile. You're not going to get those seams. So now let's go ahead and jump over into UE5 and actually use these masks to see what the results will be. So let's go ahead and bring in and import these 3 mask textures into UE5, and I'm going to walk you through how to set them up and how to use them with a very simple material, so that way we can get to see the results. So I'm going to choose a folder where I want to import these 3 texture masks into, and I'm simply going to left click, hold and drag from the folder right into UE5, and they will all be imported. Now, as a side note, it is better to pack them into a single texture into individual RGB channels instead of having them as 3 separate texture samples. But that's going to be for another tutorial. In this case, we do have 3 different textures. I also have a cube. This was taken from shapes. I dragged this cube shape into the level so I can apply a material on top and we can see the result. I'm going to go to materials folder and create a test material. I'm going to right click and empty space. And it's going to be a simple basic material. I'm going to name this m_clouds masks. And then let's apply this material onto this cube. Nothing will show up. Let's go ahead and set this up so we can see our masks. I'm going to open up the material editor by double clicking on the material. But before we use these masks inside the material editor, it's very important to enable one property that's being used as a mask, as a black and white texture. And that is to disable sRGB. So double click on the texture sample for your mask and make sure you disable sRGB right here. Masks have to have this option disabled. They have to be used in linear space as black and white values. So you want to do this for every single mask that you import, whether it's a separate texture that's being used as a mask or you have packed these 3 into a single texture into each individual channel. Make sure you disable sRGB, then click save and close. So before you drag these into the material editor, do this ahead of time. Disable sRGB for every single one. And one more. Open this up, sRGB disabled, and save. Now let's go ahead and first, before we use these masks, we need some kind of textures. So I'm going to use starter content and I'm going to use 2 different diffuse textures or albedo textures to blend between using these masks. So let's go to textures. And let's pick, let's do 1 grass and 1 dirt. Pretty good generic setup to see the results of our mask. So I'm going to use this ground grass and also this ground dirt, this gravel. I'm going to grab both of these and I'm just going to do a diffuse. Left click, hold and drag them into our material. So we have our grass and our dirt. And we're going to blend between these 2 using those masks we created. Let's drag all 3 into the material editor. I'm going to grab mask 1 all the way to 3 and drag all of them into the material editor. And as a side note, if I select one, because we disabled this RGB, the sampler type is set to linear color. That is correct. Now to blend between textures, I'm going to use a lerp. It's going to take an input from the first texture, input from the second, and then it's going to blend between using these masks, these black and white values. And based on that, it's going to show certain part of the grass and certain part of the dirt. I'm going to hold down L and left click to insert a linear interpolate. RGB of the grass will go into A, dirt RGB will go into B, and now we can use one of these masks. So because we are using RGB, every single channel is being used essentially the same information. Here's the red channel, here's the green channel, here's the blue channel, exactly the same. We can use any of these channels as our mask. If we packed these 3 into individual channels, then we would have information in the red and the green and the blue all separate, all different. but we did not. So I'm just simply going to use any of these channels as our alpha into the lerp. Now you could use RGB, but essentially you're only using black and white information, and you don't need to be using RGB, all three of these, to be plugged into alpha. We just need one of them, and they happen to be all the same, so it doesn't matter which one we use. So let's just use the red channel for everything. Plug it into alpha, and let's take a look at the result. Take the lerp and into base color input, and you can see that it's beginning to blend based on black and white values. Let's hit apply and take a look at our cube. So because we have such a unclear separation of black and white, we're not going to see much of a blend. We will see the result. You can see that we're seeing some dirt and we're seeing it blend with the grass, but there's not that much clean separation of each because of the mask that we're using. There are ways we can push these values, these black and white values, and adjust the contrast. So there's a lot more separation of black and white. So essentially we could be making adjustments right inside UE5. I'm not going to show that here, but we could set up a way to make contrast adjustments to this texture sample and push these values to be more clear in black and white. But as it is, the mask is working and we are blending using that mask between these two textures. Let's take a look at another example. So let's use our second mask. This one has a little bit more separation of black and white. This is the difference clouds filter. And let's take the red channel, plug it into alpha. We're going to have a lot more clear black and white separation between grass and dirt. And you can see it right here. And actually, let me plug in the normal maps as well. It'll be a lot more clear what it looks like. And we'll turn down the roughness because that's kind of hard to read. So I'm going to hold down 1 and left click. That's going to be a roughness value. I'm going to make it a little bit more rough, 0.7. And that's going to be plugged into roughness. So it's not going to be as shiny as it was. And let's also do the same thing for the normal map. The normal map setup is essentially the same. This way we'll have some detail appear on our textures, on our material. I just need to go grab these two textures from starter content. The same ones that I'm using for diffuse. Here's the ground for grass and ground for gravel. And I'm just going to drag them in here. And I'm going to set them up essentially the same way. So grass is on top. Make sure that the grass is on top here. Let's drag these down. And I need a lerp to also linear interpolate between these two. Connect them the same way as we did diffuse. And this output of lerp will go into normal map input, and we can use the same red channel from the texture sample into the lerp for normal map. Same mask being used for diffuse as well as for the normal. Now let's hit apply and we'll be able to tell a lot better the blend. So you can see we have the dirt, we have the grass, and it's being blended together using the lerp, using that mask. So essentially this is a slightly better result, but again, it all depends on the mask that you are using and what the effect that you want. Sometimes you want a softer blend between textures, other times you want a more defined blend. And the black and white separation of these textures is going to define how much of each of the texture shows up whenever you are using that mask and using the lerp. And of course, last, let's use the third mask. This one will have a lot more clean and clear separation of black and white, because that's what we did. We pushed the last one to have more of that black and white separation. So the red channel will go into the alpha of diffuse as well as into the normal map. So now we're using the third one. Let's hit apply and take a look at our map. And now you can really see that separation. And again, this is going to be tiling. So if we had tiling controls, we could tile this across a larger surface. Actually, we should be able to just drag this on top of this large plane. And you can see that we will have no seams across this texture, this material, and this larger surface. And by setting up more controls, we can control the tiling of the mask, tiling of each of the textures. We can set up our contrast controls to define more clean separation between the black and whites, or we can even make them more softer so they're not as defined. But as far as using Photoshop and using clouds filter and different ways of adjusting those black and white values using these different setups, you can now generate good procedural masks right out of Photoshop and use it in UE5.